Welcome to the deep dive. We are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today.
Yeah, it's a big one today.
It really is. Because we are embarking on an exploration that spans almost a millennium.
That's a lot of ground to cover.
Right. So I want you to think about the last time you sat down to watch a horror movie. Or, cracked open a thriller novel.
Or even fired up a really dark, atmospheric video game.
Exactly. And you saw those infamous words fade onto the screen. Based on a true haunting.
Oh, that changes everything.
It completely changes the way you consume that piece of media, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The safety net is suddenly just gone.
You find yourself sitting there wondering, well, where exactly does the truth end and the fiction begin?
Right. How much of the terror I'm about to witness actually happened to living, breathing people?
The psychological hook.
It's a massive hook, yeah. Creators have used it for decades. Because the moment you believe a story has actual roots in our reality,
The fear becomes tangible.
exactly. And today, we are going to explore exactly how raw historical fact mutates over centuries,
It turns into modern folklore.
and eventually into a universal shorthand for Gothic horror.
So the specific focus of our deep dive today is a name you have almost certainly encountered if you're a fan of the genre.
Blackwood Manor.
The name alone just sounds heavy.
Oh, it really does.
It evokes this very specific imagery. You picture iron gates, oppressive fog, deep family secrets.
But what's incredible is that this isn't just a random spooky name pulled out of thin air.
No, not at all. It has very real-world roots in the Scottish weir lineage.
And to trace how a real Scottish family became the poster child for the haunted house trope, we've gathered a pretty massive stack of research today.
We really did. We aren't just looking at one perspective. We have rigorous 12th century historiography papers.
We've got deep dives into Scottish architectural logs.
We're pulling from paranormal folklore archives from the absolute darkest corners of Edinburgh,
And we are tracking the name all the way through modern literary critique.
even into the development code of retro video games.
So our mission today is to act as your guides through this labyrinth of information.
We want to peel back the layers of the Blackwood name.
Right, to separate the literal bricks and mortar of medieval history from the digital fictions of the 21st century.
We're going to discover how a single family's rather tragic and genuinely terrifying history became an open-source label for terror.
By the end of this conversation, you will see how physical stone can literally dissolve into pure mythology.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning.
The real bloodline.
Yes, long before there were haunted house paperbacks or found footage horror vloggers, there was the Weir family.
And going through the historiography paper and those Scottish clan histories we have,
I was actually so surprised to see that this quintessential Scottish ghost story starts with a Norman lineage.
yeah, the name Weir didn't start out that way at all. It comes from the Norman word vir.
Veer, with a V.
Right. And that linguistic shift is our first real clue into how much history we are dealing with here.
Because the Norman word veer actually shares a Norse root with the Old English term for a dam.
Which was pronounced weir.
Right, which suggests an early connection to water management or dam construction.
Probably influencing the family's early trades long before they became landed nobility.
But to find their true entry point into the recorded annals of Scottish history, we really have to travel back to the 12th century.
To a figure named Rodulfus de Vere.
Rodulfus de Vere. I mean, you really don't get a name that sounds more like a medieval knight than that.
You really don't. And he had the pedigree to match the name.
He was a direct descendant of Aubrey de Vere.
Yes, the first Earl of Oxford. Rodulfus migrated to Scotland around 1165.
Which puts us right in the middle of the reign of King William the Lion.
And he wasn't just some wandering, low-level soldier. He brought with him a history of high-ranking service.
He immediately pledged his allegiance to the Scottish crown.
He was so embedded in the royal circles that he was actually captured alongside King William the Lion.
At the Battle of Alnwick,
Right.
in 1174.
Exactly.
Wait, captured alongside the king. That means he was fighting in the absolute inner circle.
He was right there in the thick of it.
That is a serious level of historical prestige. So how do we get from a Norman knight fighting in the 12th century to the Lord of Blackwood?
Well, the transition from military servants to landed gentry happens over the next century.
They start moving into the region of Lanarkshire.
Right. And by the late 13th century, the family had really established themselves as major players in the local geography.
We know this for a fact because of the records from 1296.
Yes, a descendant named Richardus de Vere is recorded as the proprietor of the barony of Blackwood.
And 1296 is a massive year in Scottish history.
Huge.
That's the year Richardus signed the Ragman Roll, right?
Yes, the Ragman Roll is a really crucial piece of documentary evidence here.
For those who might not know, what exactly were those rolls?
They were essentially a series of parchment documents where the Scottish nobility and gentry were forced to pledge fealty.
They had to render homage to King Edward I of England.
Right, during his conquest of Scotland.
So the fact that Richardus de Vere's signature is actually on that roll,
it proves that the Blackwood estate was already a highly significant, recognized territory.
the family's hold on the land was then formally codified a bit later,
In the year 1400.
when a royal charter officially confirmed the estate to a man named Rothald Weir.
And that charter is essentially the birth certificate of the legend.
Rothaldus Weir becomes the first official lord of Blackwood.
So by 1400, the Blackwood estate is a concrete reality.
But what I find so fascinating about the architectural history we have here
Yeah.
is that the physical Blackwood house wasn't some dilapidated, creepy mansion sitting on a stormy hill.
Not at all. It was the exact opposite.
It was a grand, traditional baronial estate. It was the absolute center of high society in Lanarkshire.
They hosted these massive social events.
The annual Blackwood Ball.
Right. Which apparently continued to be a huge deal well into the modern era.
So this was a place of immense wealth, status, and political power.
It was a literal fortress of aristocratic privilege. The Weir family were the regional power brokers.
But with that kind of intense political power in Scotland comes an almost inevitable exposure to violence.
The brutal violence of the era, yeah. The grounds of Blackwood House weren't just used for grand balls.
They soaked up a significant amount of bloodshed over the years.
One of the most documented and tragic events occurred much later, in 1685.
This is regarding the Covenanter. Right?
Yes, a very prominent Covenanter named John Brown was summarily executed right on the grounds of the estate.
The Covenanters were a Scottish Presbyterian movement that faced horrific persecution.
They essentially signed a covenant stating that only Jesus Christ could be the head of the church.
Which obviously directly challenged the king's absolute authority.
That's the core of the conflict. The British Crown viewed the Covenanters not just as religious dissenters,
but as outright traitors to the state.
and the persecution was absolutely merciless.
So having a brutal execution like John Brown's take place on the lawns of Blackwood House,
It adds this very real, very heavy layer of historical trauma to the property.
it wasn't just a rich family's home anymore.
No, it was a site of state-sponsored religious violence.
And yet, despite surviving centuries of warfare and political upheaval,
The original Blackwood House didn't actually survive the 20th century.
wasn't burned down by a mob or swallowed by some ancient curse.
It just fell victim to modern economics.
The family had moved their primary residence to another estate branch called Stone Buyers.
And the grand Blackwood House was simply demolished in 1934.
The main house was lost. But, as is so often the case with these sprawling historical estates,
Not every single brick was cleared away.
a few architectural fragments were left standing in the landscape.
And the most significant remnant, the one that really anchors the eerie atmosphere of the site today.
Is a surviving and eventually repurposed Ducat.
Okay, we absolutely have to take a sidebar here.
We do, because the architectural reviews from Historic Environment Scotland provided in our stack go into incredible depth about this.
The history of Ducats is wild.
For anyone not steeped in Scottish agricultural history, a ducat, which is the Scottish term for a dovecote,
It's essentially a massive, purpose-built stone tower for housing pigeons.
or doos as they call them.
Right. And to our modern sensibilities, building a giant stone monument for pigeons sounds totally absurd.
We view them as urban pests today.
But from the late medieval period right through to the 19th century, pigeons were a highly controlled resource.
An incredibly vital agricultural resource.
The blog by Stephen Robb at Historic Environment Scotland details how these structures were essentially winter survival mechanisms.
For the nobility,
Yes.
specifically. Because before modern farming techniques, keeping livestock alive through a brutal Scottish winter was incredibly difficult.
The ducote provided a constant self-replenishing source of fresh eggs and winter meat when other food supplies were totally non-existent.
And it wasn't just the food. They use everything.
The pigeon feathers were harvested to stuff pillows and mattresses.
There was even a local superstition mentioned in the sources that if you slept on a mattress stuffed with pigeon feathers,
You were guaranteed a long life.
which is fascinating. But the most valuable resource they produced wasn't the meat or the feathers.
It was actually the grano.
The pigeon droppings were highly prized.
It was a phenomenally potent fertilizer, completely crucial for improving the yield of the surrounding soil.
So for a wealthy landowner, a ducote was an incredibly efficient passive income generator.
You build the stone structure once,
The birds fly out during the day to feed themselves on the surrounding landscape.
and they return at night to provide you with meat, bedding, and fertilizer.
But there is a massive catch to that system, which the historical blogs highlight perfectly.
The pigeons are flying out to feed themselves, but what are they actually eating?
They weren't just eating wild berries in the woods.
They were descending in massive flocks on the cereal crops grown by the local peasants.
So the laird's fancy pigeons are essentially fattening themselves up by decimating the winter food supply of the poorest people in the community.
It was a recipe for intense class resentment.
The ducat became this glaring physical symbol of aristocratic privilege and rural inequality.
The peasants were literally starving, while the lord's birds ate their grain.
And the landowners knew this caused anger, so they lobbied for incredibly strict laws to protect their investment.
There were severe legal restrictions on who was even allowed to build a ducote in the first place.
And draconian punishments for anyone caught stealing or harming the birds.
There is a brilliant historical anecdote in the research from 1741 that perfectly illustrates this tension.
Oh, the Midlothian heist?
Yes, an 11-person gypsy gang was apprehended for what was considered a major heist.
And what did they steal? They had completely cleared out the duco of a quote-unquote person of distinction.
They bagged every single bird in the tower.
They were thrown into the Dalkeith jail for it.
Although the records suggest they actually managed a jailbreak later on.
Good for them. But it just shows you the pure value of these birds.
And because the birds were so valuable, the buildings themselves had to be feats of highly specialized engineering.
They were built like agricultural fortresses.
The early 16th century Scottish ducats were often circular, massive, beehive-shaped structures.
A pristine surviving example of this is the Corstorphine ducat over in Edinburgh.
But as time went on, the lectern design became the real architectural standard.
The lectern design is so fascinating to look at.
It means the building has a square or rectangular base, but a single, steeply sloping roof.
So from a distance, it looks exactly like a reading lectern you'd see in a church.
The design wasn't just aesthetic, though. It was entirely functional.
They had these huge, tall back walls facing the prevailing winds to shelter the birds.
And they utilized these beautiful crow-stepped gables.
That's the stair-step stonework along the edges of the roof, right?
Yes, and that actually provided extra sheltered perching space for the pigeons to sun themselves.
Every inch was engineered for the birds' protection.
They were built quite tall, so the pigeons had a clear vantage point to spot approaching predators.
And the flight holes at the very top of the structure were meticulously sized,
Just large enough to let a plump pigeon squeeze through.
but too narrow for a hawk or an owl to follow them inside.
At the ground level, they installed incredibly heavy, stout doors to keep out foxes, badgers, and feral cats.
And my absolute favorite architectural detail is the rat courses.
Such a clever piece of engineering.
To stop rats and weasels from just climbing the rough stone walls and getting into the nests, they built these smooth, projecting stone bands.
They wrapped entirely around the middle of the tower.
It created an overhang that vermin simply couldn't climb past.
And they really needed all that protection because the inside of these buildings was an industrial-scale operation.
The walls were lined top to bottom with rangs of stone nesting boxes.
Some had a few hundred, but the research mentions the largest surviving example in Scotland has a staggering 2,400 individual nesting boxes.
Imagine the logistics of trying to harvest eggs from 2,400 stone boxes stretching all the way up a high tower wall.
It would be a nightmare.
To solve this, many of the larger ducos featured a brilliant piece of internal engineering called a potence.
This was a tall, heavy timber pole set right into the center of the floor, reaching up to the roof.
With a ladder attached to it.
And it was designed to revolve.
So a worker could climb the ladder and physically pivot the entire mechanism 360 degrees.
Allowing them to smoothly access every single nesting box along the walls without ever having to climb down.
And move a heavy wooden ladder across a floor completely covered in guano.
It's agricultural genius.
He really is. But as the landowners got richer, the ducos evolved from purely functional farm buildings into massive architectural status
They
symbols.
started adding ornamental ball finials, coats of arms, carved plaques.
They built them in intricate hexagonal shapes,
They designed them in Gothic or classical styles just to match the aesthetic of the main manor house.
There's a mention in the sources of a ducat built in the 1760s at Pennacook House.
Oh yeah, that one was literally designed as a dome to replicate an ancient Roman monument.
They became monuments to ego.
But eventually, progress rendered them completely obsolete.
By the early 19th century, sweeping agricultural innovations happened,
Specifically, the introduction of new winter fodder crops like turnips.
which meant that farmers could finally keep their cattle alive and feed them throughout the harshest months without relying on the birds.
The reliance on pigeon meat just plummeted.
Coupled with the fact that the public outcry over crop damage was becoming impossible to ignore.
In fact, the destruction of these crop-eating pigeons was a heavily cited grievance during the French Revolution.
So the purpose-built ducats simply fell out of use.
They were abandoned.
And when these strange, windowless, tower-like structures fall into ruin, that is exactly where the folklore creeps in to fill the void.
The sources highlight some pretty wild superstitions surrounding them.
It was widely believed by the rural communities that if a landowner destroyed a ducat, his wife would die within the year.
But on the flip side, there was another lore suggesting that the very act of building a new one carried a superstitious death sentence for the family.
You couldn't win. It perfectly captures the fraught cultural space these buildings occupied.
They were symbols of aristocratic power that the common people simultaneously deeply resented and genuinely feared.
Today, the surviving ducos have actually found new life.
Some are protected museums,
Some serve as tasting rooms for places like the Kingsbarns Distillery in Fife.
and a select few have been converted into highly unique, very quirky small residences.
Which brings us right back to the Weir family.
When the grand, sprawling Blackwood house in Lanarkshire was completely demolished in 1934.
The estate's duco was one of the few structures left standing in the ruins.
And the architectural logs note that in the 1970s, this specific Blackwood ducote was purchased, repurposed, and converted into a small residence.
They even retain many of the original stone pigeonholes inside the walls.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the survival of these specific architectural fragments is the absolute engine of folklore.
Think about it. The grand, well-lit, bustling manor house is erased from the landscape.
What remains? A strange, windowless stone tower with a dark history,
Surrounded by the memory of executions and ancient family power.
filled with thousands of empty, staring stone boxes.
It serves as a physical anchor for the imagination.
When reality fades, ruins like the repurposed Blackwood ducat serve as blank canvases for future legends.
They give the mythology a physical place to live.
It sets an incredibly eerie stage. You have the noble bloodline, the ruined estate, the execution of the Covenanter, and the ominous stone tower left behind.
But as fascinating as the rural Lanarkshire history is,
The real pulsing dark heart of the Weir family legend doesn't actually happen out in the countryside.
no. To find the true source of the horror that infected modern pop culture, we have to move away from the country estates.
We have to dive headfirst into the dense, claustrophobic, and highly scandalous urban environment of 17th century Edinburgh.
We have to talk about the spectacular fall of the Westbow Saint.
We do. We're zooming in from the broader Weir lineage to focus on one singular, deeply infamous individual.
Major Thomas Weir.
Born in 1599 in Lanarkshire, he was the son of the Laird of Kirkton.
His life and his incredibly sudden, violent downfall are the absolute epicenter of the entire Blackwood Weir supernatural legacy.
If you look at the archetype of the fallen, corrupted patriarch that we see repeated endlessly in modern Gothic fiction,
Thomas Weir is the blueprint.
he absolutely is.
To understand why his fall was so legendary, we really have to establish who he was before the scandal broke.
Because the contrast is staggering. He wasn't some fringe lunatic.
He was a highly decorated career soldier.
He served as a lieutenant in the Scottish anti-royalist army during the brutal Irish Rebellion of 1641.
And by 1650, he had ascended to the rank of major.
And he obtained what was arguably one of the most prestigious and visible posts in the capital.
He was appointed commander of the Edinburgh Town Guard.
The authority that came with that position cannot be overstated.
The Town Guard essentially functioned as both the city's police force and its military garrison.
He was the ultimate enforcer of law and order.
To give you an idea of his public standing, Think about the execution of the Marquis of Montrose.
The defeated royalist general who was absolutely despised by the Covenanters and branded a traitor.
When he was brought to Edinburgh for his execution, it was Major Thomas Weir who was chosen to personally command the guard.
He escorted Montrose on his final, highly public walk down the Royal Mile.
It was an event witnessed by massive crowds.
And it permanently etched Weir's name into the civic history of Scotland.
So he has absolute military and civic authority. But beyond that, he was deeply, deeply embedded in the intense religious fabric of the city.
Edinburgh in the 17th century was defined by religious fervor.
Weir was a strict Covenanter, practicing a highly zealous, rigid form of Presbyterianism.
He was renowned throughout the city as a lay preacher.
The folklore blogs mention that his spoken prayers were supposedly so powerful, so moving, and so fervent
that people would travel from all across the city just to stand in his house and listen to him pray.
He was the moral compass of his neighborhood.
He lived in a tall tenement house near the top of the West Bow,
which is a steep, winding, incredibly narrow street just off the Grassmarket in Edinburgh.
Because of his unshakable public piety and the location of his home, the citizens of Edinburgh gave him a nickname.
They called him the Bowhead Saint, or the West Bow Saint.
He lived in this tenement with his spinster sister, Jean,
who was also commonly referred to as Griselle in some records.
Together, they projected this flawless facade of an impeccably devout, completely untouchable Christian household.
They were the people you went to for moral guidance.
But the reality of what was happening behind the closed doors of the West Bow was shockingly different.
And the unraveling of Thomas Weir's life wasn't a slow decline.
It was an explosion.
It happened in the spring in 1670.
Major Weir, who was now in his 70s, fell severely ill.
And as he lay on his sickbed, something broke inside him.
He began to confess.
But he wasn't confessing to minor sins or a crisis of faith.
He began frantically, openly admitting to a secret life filled with the most horrific crimes and vices imaginable to a 17th century mind.
He confessed to a lifelong incestuous relationship with his sister Jean.
He confessed to bestiality.
And, most dangerously of all, during the height of the Scottish witch hunts, he confessed to necromancy, consorting with the devil and witchcraft.
I can't even imagine the shockwaves that must have sent through the city.
The history shows that the initial reaction from the authorities was pure denial.
The Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Sir Andrew Ramsay, and the local clergy were so utterly stunned by these claims that they flat out refused to believe him.
They assumed he had a terrible fever, that it was just the delirium of a dying man.
They couldn't reconcile the West Bow Saint with these horrific words.
So they called in the most respected doctors in Edinburgh to examine him.
They desperately wanted a medical excuse to dismiss the confessions.
But the doctors examined him and delivered the worst possible news.
Weir was entirely sound of mind.
Save for his physical ailments, he was completely lucid, highly articulate, and he adamantly, fiercely stood by every single detail of his horrific confessions.
Since they couldn't sweep it under the rug medically, the authorities brought in his sister, Jean.
They likely hoped she would be the voice of reason.
That she would clear up her brother's madness and put the scandal to rest.
But she did the exact opposite.
She didn't deny a single accusation.
In fact, she corroborated every terrifying thing he said.
And then she expanded upon his confessions with some of the most bizarre, chilling details you will ever read in historical records.
Jean Weir's testimony is a masterclass in the intersection of deep psychological guilt and 17th century folklore.
She told the authorities that their mother had possessed the second sight, a very feared form of Celtic clairvoyance.
She claimed that Thomas bore the physical mark of the beast on his body.
She didn't just confess to the physical crimes. She wove incredibly detailed, vivid stories of active devilry and supernatural interactions.
The details she gave sound like they were pulled directly from a modern horror screenplay.
She claimed that on one specific occasion, a blazing phantom carriage pulled by 6 completely black charcoal horses arrived in the middle of the night at their house on the West Bow.
Its purpose: to physically transport her brother to Dalkeith for a personal meeting with the devil.
She also spoke of fairy encounters, claiming a fairy once gave her a piece of a magical tree root.
She said when she returned to her spinning wheel after receiving it, she found more incredibly fine yarn spun on the bobbin than any human could have possibly produced in that amount of time.
But of all the supernatural claims she made, the most famous,
the one detail that cemented the Weir mythology forever,
centers around Thomas's walking stick.
The records describe it as a dark, heavy thornwood staff, intricately carved with the heads of satyrs around the upper shaft.
Jean claimed, and incredibly, other terrified witnesses in the community later stepped forward to suggest that this physical staff was the actual source of his dark occult power.
The stories about this staff are wild.
The folklore says it could move entirely on its own.
People claimed it would run errands for Thomas around the city.
It would act like a ghostly butler hovering to the door to open it for guests.
And most chillingly, neighbors swore they had seen the staff hovering down the dark cobblestone streets of Edinburgh at night,
Walking ahead of Thomas as if lighting his way or leading him to his dark deeds.
with both siblings remaining completely unrepentant, fully corroborating each other's confessions regarding crimes of witchcraft, incest, and bestiality.
The civic and religious authorities had no choice. The illusion was shattered.
Thomas and Jean were immediately imprisoned in the city toll booth.
They were put on trial on April 9, 1670.
The verdict was a foregone conclusion. They were found guilty.
And the sentences carried out were incredibly grim, designed not just to execute them, but to spiritually purge them from the city.
Thomas was sentenced to be garroted, strangled to death, and then his body was to be burned at the stake.
At the Galilee, a notorious execution site located between Edinburgh and Leith.
The accounts of his final moments are deeply unsettling.
As he was being tied to the stake, the attending clergy practically begged him to pray for forgiveness to save his eternal soul.
But his reported last words were chillingly defiant.
He yelled at them, "Let me alone, I will not. I have lived as a beast, and I must die as a beast."
It is a remarkable display of absolute psychological resignation.
And the folklore sources note a crucial detail about the execution.
His infamous, carved thornwood staff was thrown into the blazing fire alongside his body.
The terrified onlookers swore that the staff took an unnaturally, impossibly long time to catch fire,
They claimed it was seen rioting and twisting in the flames,
making what they described as rare turnings.
as if it were a living creature in sheer agony.
The end for Jean was equally tragic and disturbing.
She was sentenced to be hanged at the grass market, right in the shadow of the castle.
And the historical accounts note a detail that paints a picture of complete and utter psychological collapse.
As she stood up on the gallows, preparing to die, she shockingly attempted to forcefully strip off all of her clothes in front of the massive gathered crowd.
Before the executioner could complete the sentence.
It was a chaotic, humiliating end to a family that had once been the pinnacle of local society.
It is a devastatingly dark history. And to understand why this specific story lingered for centuries, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the community.
I was just thinking that. Imagine being a regular citizen of Edinburgh in 1670.
You live in this incredibly tight-knit, highly superstitious, strictly religious community.
You have spent years looking up to Major Thomas Weir as the literal saint of your neighborhood.
You seek his guidance. You believe he's the most morally upright, respected person in town.
And then literally overnight, you discover he has been secretly indulging in the absolute ultimate taboos right under your nose.
How on earth does a community process that kind of whiplash?
How do you even walk past his front door the next morning without shuddering?
You don't. That profound psychological whiplash, that communal trauma, is exactly the crucible that creates a haunting.
The community couldn't rationally process the deception.
And so the physical space where the deception occurred, the tenement on the West Bow, absorbed all that collective horror, betrayal, and fear.
Following the executions, the house lay completely empty.
Nobody in the city dared to cross the threshold.
It remained a rotting, abandoned shell for over a century.
The local residents were terrified of the lingering evil.
They constantly reported seeing the dark windows suddenly light up at night.
They heard strange, discordant music and manic laughter echoing from the empty rooms.
They claimed to see the terrifying shapes of enormous women moving past the glass.
And of course, they still spotted the phantom black staff hovering down the dark street.
It wasn't until 1780, a full 110 years after he burned at the stake, that anyone tried to live there.
An ex-soldier named William Patullo and his wife bought the house on the cheap.
Probably thinking they were tough enough to brave the local ghost stories.
But the folklore says their courage lasted exactly one day.
They fled on their very first night in the house.
They frantically claimed that as they lay in bed, an apparition of a headless calf materialized.
It propped its front legs on the footboard of the bed and just stared at them.
They ran out into the street and never returned.
The physical fate of that deeply tainted house is also fascinating from an urban history perspective.
For a long time, it was widely believed that the house had been completely demolished during the architectural expansions of the 19th century.
However, Modern historical research, particularly highlighted in the curious Edinburgh walking tours detailed in our sources, suggests something much more insidious.
While the street-facing frontage was torn down and replaced, the inner courtyard structures and the literal foundations of Weir's home were actually incorporated and swallowed up by the adjacent newer buildings.
Today, that specific physical location is incorporated into a modern Quaker meeting house.
A Quaker meeting house. You cannot write a better irony than that.
A space dedicated entirely to absolute peace, pacifism, nonviolence, and quiet contemplation is sitting right on top of the epicenter of 17th century witchcraft and depravity.
And yet, the dark history refuses to stay buried.
The sources note that staff at the meeting house today still frequently report highly anomalous experiences.
The most common report is seeing this solid apparition of Thomas Weir,
Dressed in his 17th century coat,
walking straight through the modern plaster walls, seemingly still searching for the lost rooms of his former home.
the saga of Thomas Weir provides the narrative bedrock for the Blackwood legend.
But to fully grasp why this specific story took such deep, unshakable root, we have to pull back and look at the broader environment of Edinburgh itself.
The city is widely considered by paranormal historians to be one of the most haunted locations on Earth.
And the sources provide excellent context for why the Weir story wasn't just an isolated incident of macabre folklore, but part of a larger tapestry.
The literal landscape of Edinburgh is uniquely primed for ghost stories.
It really is. If you've ever walked through the old town, you feel it.
The geography of the city, built on this steep volcanic ridge, forced them to build upward and inward.
You have these incredibly narrow, dark alleys called closes and steep, winding streets called wynds.
It naturally feels claustrophobic, dark, and heavy with history.
To contextualize the Weir haunting, the sources explore a couple of other infamous Edinburgh locations that prove how deeply the city's traumatic past is etched into its physical spaces.
Take Mary King's Close, for example.
Mary King's Close is a phenomenal example of urban trauma turning into legend.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a bustling, albeit incredibly cramped and unsanitary, labyrinth of underground streets and dwellings running beneath the Royal Mile.
It was where the city's poorest tradesmen and residents lived and worked.
But when the bubonic plague swept through Edinburgh, the Close was hit with devastating effect,
The death toll was staggering, and there are enduring local legends.
which, while hotly debated by modern historians, are deeply ingrained in the culture.
That the authorities were so terrified of the spread that victims were forced to stay behind, quarantined and walled in, left to die horrific, lingering deaths in the dark as the area was literally sealed shut.
And the city just kept building right over the trauma.
Later, in the 18th century, the top levels of the close were partially demolished.
And the lower levels were completely buried and vaulted over to act as the foundation for the new Royal Exchange, which is now the city chambers.
So you have a literal preserved underground time capsule of misery, disease, and death sitting right under the feet of the modern government.
Naturally, it became completely shrouded in urban legends of hauntings and residual echoes.
And the most famous modern ghost story to emerge from Mary King's Close is the legend of a spirit known as Annie.
Yes, the legend of Annie is a perfect study in how modern interactions continuously shape and refresh historical folklore.
The story gained international prominence in 1992 when a highly publicized Japanese psychic visited the excavated close.
While exploring one of the darkest, most oppressive underground rooms, the psychic became deeply distressed.
She claimed to clearly see the ghost of a young child named Annie, who was crying inconsolably because she had lost her favorite doll centuries ago when the plague hit.
The psychic was so moved by this vision that she immediately went back up to the modern Royal Mile, purchased a little tartan doll from a tourist shop, and brought it back down into the dark room for Annie, who allegedly appeared to be comforted by the gesture.
And that one single act of empathy completely changed the folklore and the physical space forever.
Ever since that broadcast in 1992, visitors from all over the world have been bringing dolls, teddy bears, and toys down into the close.
They leave them in a massive, ever-growing pile in that specific room to keep Annie company.
It's oddly beautiful, but it shows how we actively participate in these hauntings.
But if you want a haunting that is the complete opposite of sad, one that is violently aggressive, you have to look at Greyfriars Kirkyard.
Specifically, the tomb of George Bloody Mackenzie.
George Mackenzie is a figure deeply, directly connected to the exact same historical era and political conflicts as Thomas Weir.
Mackenzie was born in 1636 and rose to serve as Scotland's Lord Advocate under King Charles II.
His nickname, Bloody Mackenzie, was well-earned.
He was the chief architect, directly responsible for the brutal prosecution, imprisonment, and execution of the Covenanters.
You have to remember, this is the very same religious group that Major Thomas Weir secretly betrayed.
And the exact same group that John Brown, the man executed on the lawns of Blackwood House in 1685, died for.
The history tied to Mackenzie is incredibly bloody.
After a failed Covenanter rebellion at the Battle of Bothwell Brig in 1679, Mackenzie rounded up 1,200 prisoners of war.
And incarcerated them in what became known as the Covenanters' prison.
And this prison was just a walled field right next to Greyfriars Kirkyard.
The conditions were abominable.
The prisoners were intentionally starved, completely exposed to the freezing Scottish winter elements without shelter, and treated with utter brutality by the guards.
Hundreds of them died miserably right there in the mud.
And the dark, twisted irony of it all is that when Mackenzie finally died, he requested to be buried in a massive, ornate stone mausoleum situated right next to the boundary wall of that very prison.
He was actively proud of his persecution. He wanted to look over his victims for eternity.
And because of that terrifying proximity and the sheer volume of concentrated human suffering associated with that specific patch of earth, the Mackenzie Mausoleum is regarded by paranormal investigators today as the epicenter of one of the most violent and well-documented poltergeist phenomena in the world.
Visitors taking tours constantly report being bitten, deeply scratched, physically pushed, and even knocked entirely unconscious by an unseen force.
Local lore attributes this localized violence either to the restless, tormented souls of his hundreds of victims lashing out, or perhaps to the malevolent, lingering spirit of Mackenzie himself, still enforcing his brutal will.
And the fear surrounding that tomb is so intense that the physical desecration of the space has been shocking.
The sources detail an incredibly disturbing incident from 2004 that perfectly highlights the madness this place inspires.
2 teenagers broke into Mackenzie's locked stone mausoleum in the dead of night.
They forced open a grate, found a centuries-old corpse, and using a simple penknife, they actively decapitated it.
And it gets worse.
It does. They then ran around the graveyard using the severed head as a hand puppet, terrorizing the grounds. It is absolutely grotesque.
It is a profoundly grotesque event, but what's fascinating from a legal and historical standpoint is the consequence.
The teenagers were eventually caught.
But the authorities didn't just hit them with standard vandalism or trespassing charges.
The desecration was so severe and so deeply tied to the historical sanctity of the site that they became the first people in over a century to be formally charged with the ancient Scottish crime of violation of sepulchre.
Which is the willful, malicious disturbing of a dead person.
I mean, rightfully so. Using a 17th century head as a puppet is beyond vandalism.
But looking at Mary King's Close, Greyfriars Kirkyard, and the West Bow House of Thomas Weir, a very clear pattern emerges.
These aren't just spooky stories. These are physical places in Scotland that have literally absorbed the trauma, the violence, and the extreme dark history of the people who lived and died there.
That is the crucial takeaway. The stone and mortar of Edinburgh becomes saturated with human history.
And this real-world phenomenon, this very visceral idea that a physical building or a plot of land can somehow retain the memory of past atrocities,
Sets the perfect intellectual stage for the next phase of our deep dive.
we are going to transition away from the realm of historical fact, executions, and urban legends.
And cross over into the realm of literary evolution.
We need to understand how the real-world horrors of the Weir lineage were synthesized and transformed into the defining concept of the entire Gothic horror genre.
So this is the bridge from reality to fiction.
How does the highly specific documented history of the Lanarkshire Weir family and the Blackwood estate morph into a universal trope that every horror fan recognizes?
To answer that, we have to shift our focus from Scottish history to early 20th century English literature.
And look at an author named Algernon Blackwood.
Algernon Blackwood is a towering, essential figure in the history of supernatural literature.
He lived from 1869 to 1951, and he wasn't just a pulp fiction writer trying to make a quick scare.
He was a very active, dedicated member of the Society for Psychical Research.
This meant he approached the paranormal not just as a storyteller, but with a semi-scientific, investigative, and deeply philosophical mindset.
He was intensely interested in the psychological mechanisms of fear and how human beings interact with their environments.
And according to the literary critique in our sources, His most significant genre-defining contribution is a concept called the empty house.
Before Blackwood came along, a lot of haunted house stories in the Victorian era relied heavily on overt physical manifestations.
You know, clanking chains in the dungeon, headless ghosts carrying their heads under their arms, sudden jump scares.
But Blackwood completely revolutionized the genre by pioneering the philosophy that a physical structure can absorb and retain what he called the aroma of evil deeds committed inside it.
The house itself becomes sentient, or at the very least, it acts as a massive psychic battery storing dark, emotional energy.
What's fascinating here is how directly Algernon Blackwood's literary theories parallel the exact historical reality of Major Thomas Weir.
Let's analyze one of Blackwood's most famous stories, a novella called The Damned, published in 1914.
In this narrative, Blackwood explores how the intense, suffocating religious fanaticism and profound hypocrisy of a property's previous owner can literally impregnate the physical house with a shadowy, frightening atmosphere of oppression.
The horror isn't a ghost you can see. The horror is the lingering malice soaked into the wallpaper.
That is Major Thomas Weir perfectly described.
A man whose extreme public piety and fervent religious preaching masked a secret life of absolute occult depravity and abuse.
The psychological dissonance of that massive hypocrisy is what powers the haunting in Algernon Blackwood's fiction, just as it powered the real-life terror of the citizens of Edinburgh in 1670.
The parallels are astounding.
They are inextricably linked. Algernon Blackwood fundamentally shifted the horror genre towards psychological, slow-burn tension.
The terror in his stories is entirely dependent on how the vulnerable human mind interacts with a tainted space.
And because his writing was so incredibly influential to generations of subsequent authors, and because his own surname was literally Blackwood,
an incredibly interesting linguistic and cultural shift occurred over the early to mid-20th century.
the name Blackwood slowly morphed. It stopped designating a specific historical family and a real ruined estate in Lanarkshire.
And it slowly became an adjective.
Right. Blackwood became a shorthand, a brand name for a very specific Gothic aesthetic.
If a writer described a protagonist pulling up to a Blackwood property, the reader immediately, instinctively pictured a sprawling Gothic revival mansion.
They pictured jutting, aggressive angles, impossible architectural heights, iron gates, and an oppressive, heavy silence that presses against your eardrums.
It became the gold standard for psychological dread.
And this literary rebranding was so wildly successful that contemporary creators across all modern forms of media have actively adopted the Blackwood name to invoke instant Gothic prestige.
They use the name as a signal to the audience, telling them exactly what kind of deep psychological horror story they are about to experience.
To truly see how pervasive this has become, we should explore how the Blackwood phenomenon operates right now in modern media.
Our sources provide 4 distinct fascinating examples of this evolution.
Let's dive right into them. So Darcy Coates gives us the modern literary version of this trope.
Looking at the book reviews provided by a blogger named Daniel from the Books of Daniel, Coates has essentially been crowned the Amazon queen of modern-day haunted house fiction.
She is incredibly prolific, writing dozens of these novels, and she understands the formula of the modern Gothic absolutely perfectly.
Yes, Daniel's reviews outline her successful formula very clearly. You usually have a young female protagonist who is fleeing a deeply troubled past or a bad breakup.
She moves into a large, isolated, old-world house that she usually inherits or buys for an impossibly cheap price.
She begins to experience subtle supernatural phenomena. She slowly unravels the horrific historical mystery of the house's past.
And she usually survives the climax to live happily ever after, very often with a clouder of rescue cats, which is a charming signature trademark of Coates' work.
I do love that she always ensures the cats survive, but let's look at how she utilizes the specific name we are tracking.
Her 2015 novel is literally titled The Haunting of Blackwood House.
The story focuses on a protagonist named Mara, and Mara's backstory is brilliant for this context. She was raised by a family of fraudulent scam artist spiritualists.
Because she grew up completely surrounded by fake mediums, rigged seances, and lies, she absolutely loathes anything supernatural.
She is a hardcore, unwavering skeptic. She moves into the derelict Blackwood house with her boyfriend Neil, just seeking a normal, quiet life away from the paranormal grift.
The true story of the house within Coates' fictional universe is decidedly brutal, leaning heavily into slasher territory.
The original owner was an axe-wielding serial killer, and the tortured souls of his many victims are trapped in the walls, causing subsequent families who try to live there to violently turn on each other.
But the true psychological nuance of the novel and what connects it so perfectly to our historical deep dive is Mara's fierce, almost irrational denial of the haunting as it unfolds around her.
It's maddening, but so realistic. She is literally seeing the ghostly glowing image of a hanging man in her foyer.
She is hearing the distinct, disembodied voices of crying children echoing out of an empty brick fireplace.
And yet she constantly, desperately tries to rationalize it away. She blames drafts, old pipes, hallucinations.
This intense psychological denial perfectly mirrors the real-world skepticism of the Edinburgh authorities in 1670, who initially refused to believe Major Weir's confessions because the truth completely shattered their safe worldview.
That parallel is striking. And Coates adds another brilliant layer that ties directly back to Algernon Blackwood's literary theories.
It is eventually revealed that Mara actually possesses genuine, latent psychic abilities inherited from her family line.
Even though her conscious mind violently denies the ghosts, her innate psychic energy is actively, subconsciously feeding the house.
She is acting as a battery, strengthening the physical manifestations of the spirits.
It's the ultimate modern expression of Algernon Blackwood's core idea. The human mind and the haunted space are interdependent. They react to and amplify each other's darkness.
It's a fantastic modern take on the psychology of a haunting. But how does that psychological dread translate visually?
If we jump over to the medium of film, Guillermo del Toro took this exact Blackwood concept in his 2010 movie, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, starring Katie Holmes and Guy Pearce.
Del Toro uses the name, but he takes the actual horror in a completely different, much more visceral creature feature direction.
Del Toro is a recognized master of dark fantasy, and he reimagines Blackwood Manor entirely.
He uproots it from the moors of Scotland and places it as a sprawling 19th century Gothic mansion in Providence County, Rhode Island.
The backstory he creates involves a renowned, obsessive wildlife painter named Lord Emerson Blackwood, who originally built the house.
And the threat they face inside isn't a traditional translucent ghost or a lingering psychic residue.
The horror stems from an ancient, sealed ash pit hidden deep inside a basement fireplace.
Inside this pit live these terrifying ancient creatures. Del Toro actually modeled their movement and anatomy after naked mole rats.
They are essentially malicious, highly intelligent, vermin-like tooth fairies that aggressively demand the teeth of children, and they eventually drag Lord Blackwood himself down into the dark pit.
The naming conventions Del Toro uses here are certainly no accident. He deliberately named the doomed painter character Emerson Blackwood as a direct, loving tribute to Algernon Blackwood.
Furthermore, the core concept of these creatures being an ancient, pre-human, magical, but incredibly nasty species of fairy is heavily inspired by the work of the Welsh author Arthur Machen.
Macon's horrific fairy stories are even explicitly referenced by a librarian character within the film's dialogue.
It's such a fascinating, weird blend. You take the prestigious, atmospheric Blackwood name, you apply it to a classic American haunted mansion, and then you fill the basement with Arthur Machen's horrific mole rat fairy creatures.
It really shows how versatile the name has become. But if you want to see a project that genuinely tries to synthesize all of the real, granular historical facts we discussed in the first half of this deep dive into one cohesive narrative, we have to look at the world of interactive fiction.
This is perhaps the most remarkable source in our stack. We're looking at a developer named Stefan Vost in his 2023 release, The Ghosts of Blackwood Manor.
What makes this project so unique is the chosen medium. It is not a modern 3D horror game.
It is a retro, purely text-based adventure game written in Infocom's highly advanced Z-Machine format, and the narrative itself is specifically set in the cold winter of 1986.
I have to geek out about the technical side of this for a second because reading through Vode's development logs on itch.io is just amazing.
This isn't just a modern game with a filter trying to look old. He built it to run natively on actual vintage hardware.
Vote programmed it so it's playable on systems like the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum Next, the Amstrad CPC.
You can play it on an Apple II if you use a CP/M soft card, the Mega 65, and even classic 1980s Macintosh computers.
He went so far as to release a physical version in a chunky cardboard box that perfectly mimics the classic 1980s Infocom packaging, complete with a physical PlayIF reference card to teach modern players how to actually type commands into text parsers.
The technical dedication is undeniably impressive, but Vought's narrative approach is what truly concerns our historiography today.
The game follows a struggling novelist named Thomas King and his wife Cora as they explore the manor.
But unlike Del Toro's creature feature, or Coates' serial killer backstory, Vogt roots his fiction deeply, intricately in the factual Scottish history we discussed earlier.
His development logs explicitly state that he spent over a year researching Scottish medieval history and folklore to ensure the game's internal lore was painstakingly accurate.
And it absolutely shows in the gameplay. The game heavily features the dark history of the great Scottish witch hunts.
It forces the player to interact with actual real-world locations, like the ruins of Lindisfarne Abbey.
It incorporates authentic, terrifying Celtic mythologies like the Kelpies, the water horses that drown you, and the Bean Nye, which is the mythical washerwoman at the ford who scrubs the bloodstained clothes of those about to die.
Most impressively, the game explicitly names a Rothaldus Weir, the actual historical man who received the 1400 charter we talked about, as the first Lord of Blackwood.
Vogt is playing a very sophisticated metatextual game with history here.
He is taking the real, documented Weir lineage of Lanarkshire, acknowledging the cultural memory of the 1670 Edinburgh witch trials heavily associated with Thomas Weir, and weaving them all into a fictional 1986 investigative narrative.
He notes in his logs that some of the complex puzzles in the game can literally be solved by the player opening a browser and looking up the real Scottish history on Wikipedia.
He is actively enforcing the idea that the horror you are experiencing in the game is terrifying, precisely because it is grounded in documented historical fact.
It's the ultimate love letter to both retro gaming preservation and deep Scottish history. But the evolution of the Blackwood legend doesn't stop in 1986.
To see where the myth is living right now, today, we have to move into the digital era.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the most recent iteration of Blackwood Manor is a 2025 found footage film that takes the ancient legend and drags it, kicking and screaming, straight into the hyper-fast world of TikTok and YouTube vloggers.
The 2025 found footage film, which is simply titled The Haunting of Blackwood Manor, represents a massive, jarring, stylistic shift for the trope.
The cinematography entirely abandons the sweeping Gothic aesthetic of fog and iron gates.
Instead, it is shot vertically and horizontally on high-end smartphones and DJI Osmo Pocket 3 cameras.
It presents itself entirely as the raw, unedited, recovered footage of a spectacularly failed viral vlog attempt by a desperate husband and wife influencer team.
And the nature of the horror they face has completely changed. They aren't dealing with axe murderers or psychic residues or tooth fairies.
They're dealing with pure, unadulterated existential dread. The film introduces an incomprehensible entity known as the Stitcher.
And under the Stitcher's influence, the manor itself acts as an endless, reality-bending loop.
The vloggers walk through a bedroom door and instantly end up back in the basement where they started. Time, geography, and basic reality break down entirely on camera.
This shift in the nature of the threat is highly significant. It moves the concept of the Blackwood haunting away from a historical, localized trauma and transforms it into an existential, modern trauma.
But the meta-narrative of the film is its most brilliant aspect. The entire movie is a razor-sharp critique of modern internet culture.
The protagonists are actively exploiting the manor. They're desperately trying to commodify its dark history for social media clout, hoping for likes, subscribes, and lucrative brand sponsorships.
The film is basically screaming at the audience that the real haunting of Blackwood Manor today isn't ghosts or demons hiding in the dark. It's the endless commodification of tragedy online.
The true horror they experience is being trapped in an algorithm, constantly forced to produce increasingly extreme content for a faceless audience that ultimately just wants to watch them suffer and break down.
Precisely. It brings the centuries-old legend full circle. The haunting always mutates to reflect the specific anxieties of the audience consuming it.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. We have traversed a truly massive amount of ground today.
We've looked at 12th century Norman knights riding with kings, a 17th century warlock executing covenanters, Victorian literary theories of psychic residue, 1980s text adventures programmed on Commodore 64s, and 2025 found footage vloggers trapped in TikTok loops.
So what does this all mean?
After sifting through all these eclectic sources, what is the actual truth of Blackwood Manor? If a listener listening right now books a flight to Scotland and goes looking for the real house, what will they actually find?
According to the brilliant conclusions drawn in the historiography paper we started with, there is no single true story. Instead, you have to understand it as three distinct, overlapping layers of truth.
Layer 1 is the historical legal truth. This is the hard, documented reality, the Norman roots of the Weir family, the physical barony of Blackwood and Lanarkshire, the 1685 execution of John Brown on the lawn, and the very real, very horrific 1670 trial and execution of Major Thomas Weir and his sister Jean in Edinburgh.
Layer 2 is the literary truth. This is the vital framework provided by Algernon Blackwood in the early 20th century, which defined the empty house as a psychological entity that absorbs the aroma of evil deeds.
This layer took the raw historical facts of the Weir family and alchemized them into a universal, structural philosophy of fear.
And finally, Layer 3 is the contemporary digital truth. Today, the name Blackwood Manor functions as a versatile open-source label for absolutely any Gothic horror project seeking instant prestige.
It has become so completely unmoored from its actual Scottish roots that there are completely unrelated real-world places actively capitalizing on the name's spooky reputation.
For example, our sources point out that there is currently a luxury holiday rental Airbnb located in Willowvale, Australia, actually named Blackwood Manor.
It features a private pool, modern amenities, and possesses absolutely zero historical connection to the Weir family or Scotland.
That is hilarious. They are literally just using the name because it sounds perfectly Gothic.
Exactly. What I truly want you, the listener, to take away from this exploration is that a haunting is not just a translucent ghost standing at the end of a dark hallway.
A true haunting is a living, breathing tradition of storytelling. The historical name of Blackwood has been continuously repurposed, reshaped, and rewritten for centuries to perfectly reflect the changing, deep-seated fears of each new generation.
In the 1600s, it reflected a terrifying community fear of religious hypocrisy and hidden witchcraft.
In 1914, it reflected a Victorian fear of psychological taint and madness.
And today, in 2025, it reflects our very modern fear of digital endless loops, algorithms, and a complete loss of objective reality.
The legend survives specifically because it adapts. It mutates to scare whoever is currently listening to it.
It is an incredible, sprawling journey, from a real Norman knight signing a parchment roll to a viral vlogger trapped in an infinite digital loop.
It truly is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building upon everything we've discussed today.
We know from the historical archives that the physical site of Major Thomas Weir's horrific history, his painted tenement house on the West Bow in Edinburgh, was eventually absorbed and transformed into a Quaker meeting house.
It became a physical space dedicated entirely to absolute silence, pacifism, and deep, quiet reflection.
Right, a total beautiful inversion of the violence, the witchcraft, and the chaos that originally occurred there.
Exactly. Yet while that physical space in Edinburgh finally found silence, the digital Blackwood Manor is louder than it has ever been in human history.
It is filled with viral vloggers screaming into smartphone cameras, retro video game ports generating endless forum debates, and constant streams of online book reviews.
So I ask you to ponder this as you go about your day. In our modern age, have our digital spaces, our forums, our social media feeds, our endless wikis become the new empty houses that Algernon Blackwood warned us about?
Are our servers and our glowing screens the new walls, actively absorbing the aroma of our modern cultural anxieties and trapping us in an endless, terrifying digital loop of our own making?
That is a genuinely chilling thought to leave on. Are we actively haunting our own digital spaces?
Thank you so much for joining us in this deep dive. We hope we've helped illuminate how physical history transforms into psychological horror. Keep questioning the stories you consume, stay curious, and perhaps take a little closer look at the history of your own home. You never know what layers of truth might be hiding in the bricks.